Hey, Kara, darling, and welcome to the Tick Boot Camp podcast.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Well, we are very excited to have you, and we would like to first have you introduce yourself and give folks some sense of first where you are now, where you're from, and the name of the clinics that you've been a part of.
Sure. So I am currently located in Wilmington, Delaware, which is sort of a Philly suburb. I'm originally from Arkansas, from Fayetteville, Arkansas. And I also lived for a time in Denver, Colorado. So as we talk sort of about my background with Lyme and where I've been and how I came to this, all of those places sort of come into play. But the clinics that I helped found are called Lighthouse Complex Care Clinics. Our first clinic opened in Denver in 2019. And then our second clinic opened here in Wilmington, Delaware in July of 2023. So
Okay,
about
so
a year and a half ago.
let's talk about your background. So, you did share with me earlier that you grew up in Arkansas, and
Mhm.
Arkansas, of course, is tick country. So, talk to us about what it was like to grow up in Arkansas, and specifically share with us what your experiences were through your childhood with ticks and tick diseases.
Sure. So I grew up in rural Arkansas, and it was really, really common to have tick bites pretty much all the time. You know, we don't have much of a winter in southern Arkansas where I grew up. And so we would go outside, and I grew up on a farm. Daddy had 255 acres, and we would play outside. And then mom would say, "Come in for dinner." And it was just our regular process. We would go into the bathroom, we would do a tick check, we'd pull everything off, throw it in the toilet, flush it down, wash our hands, and go eat dinner. And so literally, I've probably had thousands of tick bites myself throughout the years. My grandfather had Rocky Mountain spotted fever at one point. My sister got Lyme disease at one point. My dogs had Ehrlichia, and but my experience with tick-borne illness as a chronic condition did not start in my childhood, because in all of those instances, they were able to be rapidly diagnosed. Like if you live in tick country, you sort of know what that stuff looks like. And they had about 3 weeks of antibiotics and a little bit of rest, and then they were able to sort of proceed without long-term sequelae.
Well, there's
And
another
so,
piece, but Carol, let me ask you to pause for a second because I think there's another piece to this, and I think it's an
mhm,
important piece, which is it seems to me that your parents were enlightened people because what they did is they had you come in and check for ticks every day, right? So
right.
if you were checking for ticks every day, there wasn't going to be a long period of time that a tick was going to be feeding on you. And depending on the microbe that a tick is spitting into you, and the
Mhm,
type of course, the species of the tick, the faster you remove a tick from it, attaching to you, the
right.
less likely it is that you're going to get sick. And of course, even if there were a sufficient amount of microbes spit into you because you were taking the early prophylactic antibiotics or whatever other tools were being used at that time, your family didn't get sick, right? I mean, it was a part of your lives.
Mhm.
You were coming in contact with ticks.
Well,
There was some acute illness, but it seems like everybody was able to manage that.
yeah, and I think it had a lot to do also with the way that people's immune systems work, right?
Okay.
There's not a lot of complex chronic illness in my family until we got to my children and that generation.
So let's
And the
let's talk about that, Kev. Tell us about your children, and I'd like you to contrast the experiences that you had as a child to your children's experience, and why you think your children became chronically ill, and you in your generation or your level of
Mhm.
the family tree and above did not become sick.
Right. So I have four kids, and my oldest child has a different father than my younger three.
Okay.
And it's pretty obvious if you look at our sort of the way that health works with those three children. My oldest son, he's got a healthy, robust immune system. He does not have any health issues. He eats what he wants. He does what he wants. He can get by with about 4 hours of sleep. I mean, couldn't we all in our early 20s? but he doesn't have health issues. But my other three children, they are vulnerable, and they tend to have, it was whatever combination of genetics from my husband and myself with my younger three. They all have system dysregulation, and they all have immune mediated encephalopathy. So when they get whatever illness, their immune system gets confused and it attacks their brain. And so it was actually through the discovery process of what was going on with them and their neurological issues that I first was introduced, even way before I was involved in the clinics, to complex chronic illness that could have, tick-borne illness as triggers, or immune system dysregulation that could cause, tick-borne illnesses to become a chronic thing. So my first experience was when my third child, he was 3.5, and he had what looked like sudden autistic regression. He looked like he went from a period of 3 weeks of being like a precocious kid. He had his training wheels off his bike at 3.5. He, was doing like simple additions, and he was climbing all over the place, and he played t-ball, and he did all these things, and in a period of about 3 weeks he completely regressed. He was losing functional language, he was hallucinating, he was starting to self-harm. He had all of these issues, and through the discovery process with him and his inflammatory his infectious triggers for the immune system confusion, that ultimately what it ended up being, we discovered that he did actually have Bartonella. And we were in Arkansas at the time. He had several tick bites, but his immune system, I feel like his immune system wasn't able to do the eradication piece that my nuclear family growing up was able to do. And so he did suffer neurological sequelae, and other things that we related to his chronic Bartonella infection, until we figured it out and were able to treat it. And
So
later.
Tara, let me ask you if I could. You suggested earlier in your description of your children's health journey that your oldest child has a robust immune system, and he has not been affected by chronic illness, and
Mhm,
because he has a different genetic profile, because he has a different father, you think
mhm.
the younger children were more vulnerable because of their genetic code rather than something else. Do you believe it is truly the genetic predisposition that resulted in your younger children being sick? Or is it possible that their immune system had been altered as a result of perhaps congenital Lyme disease, or some other congenital tick disease that may have been passed on to them in utero?
I don't think so, just because my kids have been extensively tested for all sorts of things, and we understand how their immune system works. And for example, my son that I was telling you about, who was the first affected, he has a problem with something called his toll-like receptors, and those are receptors on your cell that grab fragments of bacteria and viruses and tell your immune system to fight them off. And his receptors don't work very well. So when he, say, for example, encountered, Bartonella through a tick bite, the receptors that should have, recognized the surface of the Bartonella cell as a pathogen didn't pick it up. They don't work. We also have tested extensively different parts of my kids' immune systems. We trend their T cells, their B cells, their natural killer cells. We can sort of see what's going on. They do actually have a few minor kinds of genetic mutations that affect their immune system. And what we found, not only through my kids, but as we've started these clinics, and we, have broadened, my kids are one piece, but broadening the perspective and treating, hundreds of patients with Lyme and tick-borne illnesses and other things, is that our stance at Lighthouse complex care clinics, is that really it's the underlying immune system that makes a person vulnerable to these insults, which is why someone could, have thousands of tick bites and not ever have any chronic sequelae, and someone else could get one tick bite and be very severely affected and become bedbound. And the other thing that we find with these patients are, if you don't address the immune system, if you just go after the pathogen, there's a lot of people, a lot of patients and practitioners alike, that they get fixated on the pathogen, whether it's Lyme or Babesia or Bartonella or mycoplasma, whatever it is, they're fixated on that one pathogen. And then they treat and treat and treat and treat and treat, and they don't necessarily get better. And they're throwing everything in the kitchen sink at it, and they still feel really bad, and they're not getting to wellness. And a lot of times, not maybe not every time, but a lot of times what we see is it's because focusing on killing the pathogen is not the way you beat it. The way you beat
Okay,
it
so
is
let me ask you to pause,
Sure.
so that, because Matt is going to join in this conversation too, because we focus on right where you are on a regular basis. So, and this is of course a chicken or the egg question, and one of the things that we do here at Tech Boot Camp is I will generally ask you to outline the principles, and then Matt is going to talk to you about some of the tactics that you can deal with it. So you're like you, we believe that we actually, one of the things we talk about is the risk formula. General Stanley McChrystal, in his book Risk, argued that the risk of any outcome is actually formulaic, and it's vulnerability times
Mhm.
threat equals risk. And if you either reduce the vulnerability or you reduce the threat, then your risk is reduced. So like you, we believe that it's a combination of both the microbes and the terrain that will determine whether or not you're going to get sick. Vulnerability being terrain, the microbe insult being the threat, and it's those two things together will ultimately make you sick. And like you, I think, are arguing, we believe that the immune system will win the day, and we should be focusing on the immune system. But I'm not sure that in every case it's as clean as maybe you are arguing it. So let's talk about principles first, right?
Well,
So
we have further evidence though, Rich, that this is true, because what happens is people trade pathogens, so they come into
people what
they
pathogen?
tr they trade pathogens.
Trade.
So yeah, so you might come in and you might say, okay, I have this, chronic mycoplasma infection that's been triggering me, and we may work with you, and we may, by all evidence, get rid of that chronic micro-P infection. And then, you may come back a few months later and say, oh, well, now strep's triggering my neurological inflammation. Or after that, we may deal with that. And you may come back and now it's Bartonella, or like we call it whack-a-mole. Because until we actually are able to modulate and help, power and, regulate your immune system, then it's just going to continue to be vulnerable. And maybe a virus is going to get you next time. It's not so much the pathogen as it is how your immune system responds to
Well,
that
well,
pathogen.
let's discuss that, because the question is always going to be: is it a genetic flaw in your immune system? Is it a flaw in your immune system that is being triggered by a microbe or a series of microbes? Are your epigenetics being changed as a result of the microbe load? So I think the question is a pretty complex question.
Well, it could
Um,
also be an environmental issue that's suppressing your immune system and makes you susceptible to the microbe. It's not
for
just
sure,
microbes or
for
or
for sure.
genetics.
No,
It
no,
could be
no. It could
environmental influences too.
it
So,
could be mold, it could be heavy metals, it could be a number of
mhm.
different factors, right? So that's why I wanted to challenge you on this piece of it from the standpoint of the principle, right? So the principle is we have an immune system, which is the vulnerability piece, that is not able to protect your body against the threat, right? And the threat being in this case of what we're describing, microbes. But as you had pointed out, we're picking up microbes all throughout our lives, right? I mean, we just pick them up, and ultimately, when our immune system is healthy, it's managing these microbes in our microbiome, and because we're managing it in the microbiome, it isn't causing us to suffer disease, right? But then at some point, our immune system is not functioning at an optimal level, and it could be stress, it could be environmental stresses, it could be microbial, it could be, I mean, a number of different factors that could result in us immune suppression, and because we are suffering from suppression, then what's happening is some of the microbes that we've been carrying, whether they're tick diseases or not, start to take off, which is the whole whack-a-mole scenario that you were just arguing before, right? But what I'd like to do is sort of explore your personal journey, because I think you've come to the conclusion, and I'd like to explore why you've come to this conclusion, that your younger children are have suffered disease as a result of purely their genetics, and not epigenetic changes that had occurred to them either in utero or at some other point later on, but it was a genetic predisposition that made them more vulnerable than their brother who has a different genetic code.
Their brother grew up in the same uterus.
Well,
Yeah, their brother had thousands of tick bites. Matter of fact, their brother had more tick bites, especially like I said, I think I told you my youngest one, she still has, immune system vulnerability. She still has post-infectious autoimmune encephalitis. She's never really encountered a tick bite because we got savvy and, we didn't live in the same environment. But she still has, post-infectious encephalopathy, and she's sensitive, to strep. And so I really want to have them all sequenced, and I want to look at it. It's not just that, okay, I mean, you have to have in my opinion, you have to have the genetic predisposition to some sort of dysregulation, not to, not to compensate. But that doesn't mean that there's not things that influence genetics, like you mentioned, epigenetics or genetic expression. There's certainly things that influence that, okay? And B, it's not like you can't, just because you have a gene that can't make a product, it doesn't mean you can't actually supplement the product to correct that. Just because you have a gene that, needs a certain nutrient or substrate that you aren't able to process, it doesn't mean that there are not ways you can course correct. And don't get me wrong, I don't really think, I mean, there's not a gene that says, Lyme's going to kick your butt. But there are plenty of genes that say, okay, maybe you don't have the ability to make the signaling chemicals in your body optimally, like, someone else who typically does. And those signaling chemicals in your body that tell your immune system, hey, get rid of this pathogen, or even, hey, make these neurotransmitters, or, hey, let's upregulate your mitochondrial function so you have the energy for your immune system to attack the pathogen. All of that stuff, yeah, that's genetic predisposition. Those kinds
or
of vulnerabilities.
but is it genetic predisposition, or is it genetic code that has been altered by a bug or a combination of bugs that is causing either genetic changes or expression changes, and it's not necessarily something that you're born with, but it's something that's changing as a result of the microbe load.
I mean, I guess it could be, but another thing, I'm a pretty practical person, right? And while it's interesting and fascinating to try to figure out some things, like what's the end result? You have a complex chronic infection and you have a dysregulated immune system. So it's my job, or our clinic's job, to help figure out how to bring the immune system back to stasis and how
All
to get
right.
rid of the microbe.
We're,
So,
we're together, right? So, and the reason I'm asking you the question is, and Matt and I have this debate all the time, is when you're dealing with a community like ours, that even the most well-heeled members of our community are going to have limited resources. They're going to have some limits to their resources.
mhm.
And part of the questions that we're asked all the time, and we want to debate about all the time, is where are our testing dollars best spent? Should we be spending money on genetic testing, which Matt in some cases will argue we should. I argue almost always we should not.
Mhm.
Are we more wise to be spending our testing dollars on immune function tests? Is it more wise to be spending
I
our
would vote for immune function
all
tests,
right,
because
well,
that's what determines in the practical world how you're going to respond to that pathogen. And it also is what determines how you're going to fix it. If I know, what part of your immune system is broken, or what part of your immune system signaling isn't working, then I have a shot at trying to help you biochemically correct. But
okay,
if I have
Kara,
no,
let me give you option C,
okay.
because you jumped on option B. Option
Mhm.
C is microbial testing, and what kind of microbial
Oh, I
testing?
knew that. I knew that, but I'm not going there either. I
Uh,
mean, the most important thing I think is to, control the immune dysregulation. And yeah, there's arguments on either side, and that's a pretty fascinating debate. But I mean, what's going to, or what, I mean, the process that we work through in clinic, we have sort of a systematic diagnostic evaluation for people who come in and have these complex chronic issues, and it's all based on chemical signaling. And we don't start with actually either of those. We start with your gut microbiome. We start
okay.
with the energy going in,
All right.
right? And then we go to nutrient deficiencies and look
All right.
for, your cofactors of your signaling processes and all of that. Then we go to methylation. Then we go to the system that builds the signaling chemicals and breaks them down and is responsible for your neurotransmitters and your hormones and your immune system signaling. And we make sure that piece it seems to be in working order. And then we go to mitochondrial function, because if I don't have energy to power your immune system, I'm not getting rid of anything. And then after we've, come in and evaluated and tried to bring all of those things to stasis, then we're going to start looking for infectious and environmental influences. Because if I correct your mitofunction and I correct your nutrient deficiencies and your gut microbiome, you may be able to kick the infectious thing by yourself. You may be able to take off and get rid of that without me even having to come in and directly, attack the pathogen. You may not. It's probably a toss up depending on what's happening. But the only way we know is by testing, treating, retesting, and then also trending and looking systematically through the systems. Otherwise, I'm just seeing what sticks on the wall, and I'm going to get lost, because anybody who has a complex chronic illness or complex chronic tick disease, they're going to be complicated. They're not simple patients. If they were simple patients, they would have gone to their GP, gotten their pill, and gone home. Or they would have eliminated gluten and felt fine. But people who have these complex chronic illnesses and responses that are pretty incapacitating, or that they have to really work hard to get back to some baseline level of health, they have multi-systemic involvement, and they deserve a little bit more systematic and thorough evaluation, and somebody to help them keep track, because it's real easy to get lost. We call it chasing rabbit trails. So you'll have this rabbit trail or that rabbit trail, and you may never get to the core issue just because you forgot about it. Or I can't tell you how many times we do a thorough records review anytime someone comes into clinic, and people come in 700, 800 pages of records. That's common. And our clinic has a team of PhDs that comb through those records, pull out the relevant synopsis and information, and pass them to the providers before you even walk in the door. And I can't tell you how many times in those 700 or 800 pages, there's already something in there that should have been dealt with or should have been treated, or that's a clue to how to bring that patient back to health, and it was just dismissed or ignored. Or overlooked. Sometimes it wasn't even intentional. Sometimes there was just so much going on for the patient that, that whoever they were seeing at the time got focused on A, and C just sort of fell off by the wayside, and they never got back to it.
So, Karen, give us an example of what you mean by that issue that should have been resolved that wasn't resolved. Is this an issue that is defining the immune dysfunction that made them vulnerable to the chronic presentation, or is it something else?
It could, I can give you one example, what
Okay.
comes to mind all the time. We get these patients' records, and they've had an EEG, and they've had abnormalities in their EEG. And because it wasn't a full-blown seizure, it's never even been looked at or investigated. They've never trialed a seizure medication. They've never had a more extensive EEG. They've never had any workup around cerebral folate deficiency
Okay.
or any of the other things. No immune mediated tests. It's just, oh, okay, and then it just gets buried in the file. Or another thing that happens really commonly is someone tests positive for Lyme. We're talking about Lyme. They test positive for Lyme. They go in. They get a few months worth of treatment or whatever, and then they just move on. They don't retest, and we're like, well, where's the retest? Oh, well, we never did that. After we did 6 months of rifampin, and then we just moved on, and now we're working on EBV and taking some Valtrex, and we're like, what, hold on, back up. We have to test, treat, and retest, but this happens all the time. And the point is not what needs to be done. It's that just the tracking, the health tracking, like keeping track of what has been tested, what hasn't been tested, and looking at people in a very systematic way to evaluate them and make sure you're checking all of those boxes, instead of just, another thing we see a lot of times is people will have had, 300 tests run all at once, And if you run all your tests at once, there's just no way you're going to be able to implement effectively treatment for everything you're going to find. And then you're going to miss pieces. And so, like, we do one test, one appointment, one variable. We're big fans of the scientific method. Let us limit our variables and see what actually helps before we move on to the next thing. And sometimes it makes patients a little bit angry because they want 10 things tested because they want to feel better. But we have to sort of back up and explain, hey, if we test 10 things, we can't treat 10 things at once. So let's start at the bottom. Let's do this test, and then let's treat it, and then let's retest and make sure we've resolved that issue as we move forward. Now, that doesn't mean we can't work with like acute symptoms, right? Like if you're not sleeping, you're not healing. If you're constipated, you're going to be in bad shape. If you're in pain, we're not just going to ignore that, but we're going to make sure that we're going through the systems and the diagnostic steps, one at a time, and tracking those things so we don't get lost, and then people don't get better.
So, Karen, is there anything that you all do before you even start testing? Meaning, one of the things that we've identified here at Tick Boot Camp is a pattern of healing, or a pattern of successful steps that people take when they successfully heal. And we've actually identified one of those steps as prehabilitation, where we're looking at some foundational issues like your diet, your movement, your sleep, your environment, and your stress levels. So are there some things that you're doing to identify potential lifestyle changes that could be made to enhance your terrain and make it more likely that you can be another one, of course, is opening up your pathways, right? Are there any steps that you're taking even before you start testing to try to get some of these lifestyle pieces in place to see if that's going to give you a kickstart in having a more healthy immune system?
Well, I mean, I guess it's before you start testing what is the question. When you sign up for our clinics, you fill out a 17-page questionnaire, and the last like 10 pages of it, it's a symptomatic checklist. And before you even walk in the door, by that symptomatic checklist, every question in that symptomatic checklist is tagged to a medical etiology. So, for example, this is one of my favorites just because it's so odd and it's so weird. But people who have a phenol sensitivity, phenol is a chemical in your diet and plants and red wine and all sorts of things. People who have a phenol sensitivity, when they get angry or stressed, their ears turn red, and they tend to have a lot of atopic presentations, and they're sulfur deficient. They need sulfur, like you said, opening up your pathways, your detox pathways. But there's a question on our questionnaire, well, when you're angry, do your ears get red? And people are like, what does that even mean? Why would you ask me that? Well, I'm asking you that because before you even come into clinic, if your ears are getting red when you're angry, I'm going to have a high alert. I'm pretty sure that you're going to need extra sulfur support. You're going to need extra
Ah,
detox pathway support. And so we start before we even know you with that 17-page questionnaire and those symptoms that are tagged to etiologies, and then we do your records review. So you'll send us everything that you've done in the past 2 years, and then anything before that that isn't likely to have changed. So any imaging, genetic testing, if you had a big hospitalization
okay.
for pneumonia at some point, and we're going to have looked at all of that. Then when you come into our clinic, we're already going to have some information about some of the interventions that we can do to start laying that groundwork. And
Okay.
before we would ever attack a pathogen, before we would ever start trying to kill something, that whole that whole step, that process that we go through, that ensures that your detox pathways would be open before we even overloaded them and risk a Herxheimer reaction. Because
Okay.
we
So,
actually.
let's hit the pause button again. So because there's a place I want to go with you, right? So you had shared with me earlier
Mhm,
that in your children's generation, as opposed to your generation and your parents' generation, that despite all of you, your parents' generation, your generation, or your children's generation, all coming in contact with tick diseases and tick microbes, you all in your generation and your parents' generation were able to manage these microbes, and your
mhm,
children have not been able to manage these microbes.
mhm,
The reason I was asking about the prehabilitation piece and this first step that you're taking is I'm assuming, and I may be wrong, so please clarify. I'm assuming that you may believe that the reason you all in your generation and your parents' generation didn't get sick, as opposed to your children, is not the microbes that they're coming in contact with versus the microbes you coming in contact with, but that you were less vulnerable, or your immune system was more robust and you were able to manage these diseases, right? So if that's the case, do you believe much of what's happening in your children and my children's generation is really a function of the lifestyle changes that have occurred culturally, and as a result of that, we have, the first step should be to try to tease out those cultural and lifestyle changes. For example, the quality of the food, the amount of movement, the sleep, the amount of stress they're under from social media, and computer use and phone use and those kinds of things. If we start to tease those things out and reduce those stresses, that perhaps that might be enough for people to heal, or if not heal, at least get a kickstart on their healing.
It's not enough to heal people. It definitely matters, though, a lot. I think that it's not black or white. It's not either or. I think that, in my grandparents' generation and even in my generation, we were under a lot fewer environmental stressors.
Such as what?
We
Give me examples of the difference between the environmental stressors that your children are managing or not managing, and the environmental
uh,
stresses that you did not have.
Microplastics. Microplastics were not introduced until I mean, plastic wasn't really introduced. I used to babysit this man who had Alzheimer's disease, and he loved to recount the story of how he was in Boy Scouts and the first time he ever saw a Ziploc bag, and he was actually from my grandparents' generation, but he was an adult when he saw a Ziploc bag. So it would have been when my dad was a kid. So sometimes 60s, 70s. I mean, and it varies, I'm sure. I mean, we were in Arkansas, so maybe people in New York saw him sooner. but, but the fact that we introduced plastics on a widespread level in the 60s or 70s, I didn't have to deal with microplastics in my drinking water and breathing microplastics in the air
I,
in the same way that my kids are having to deal with that. Processed foods. I didn't have to. I mean, I remember canning with my mom. We canned our stuff at home. We did have some store-bought canned food, but we didn't. That wasn't like we didn't have. It wasn't like just a staple thing, and we didn't have all of the. I mean, or as much of the puffed, extruded, processed stuff. Those kind of things. I think now it's just in schools. Even in school lunches. I remember when we got a soda vending machine in high school. And now there, I mean, it's insidious in everything. A lot of processed and environmental stressors that our kids today have to deal with. The whole dopamine hit from the screen addiction, which I think you mentioned earlier. I mean, and I'm pretty intelligent, I'm pretty savvy, I understand it, but I remember my youngest being 6 months old, and she had a little phone watching cartoons. She would have my phone. I didn't have a cell phone until I was in my early 20s. And so like that, the dopamine hit there, all of those things are definitely going to be influences, and they're going to draw us away from health, or optimal health. But just taking their cell phones away, I don't know what you're going to do about microplastics. I think we're all a little bit screwed there. Well, and even the other factor too is as the summers get longer and hotter and warmer, then the insects' lifespans are affected. And if you're from rural Arkansas where you don't really have a winter anyway, then that doesn't change much for you. But if you're from, Pennsylvania, where you used to get a nice hefty snow every winter that killed off the ticks, and now you get a dusting a couple of times a year, then there's more ticks and more pathogens and more exposure there to deal with. So it's definitely multifaceted, the environmental influences, and we don't ignore those at all. Our foundation is gut and microbiome and diet as part of that, and our nutrient deficiencies are also. So we do dietary evaluation, and depending depending on the patient, that might look like some testing, it might look like some trial and elimination, or it might be just a focus on moving from processed to whole foods. It's very, very individualized in our clinic, because as complex uh, as each patient is, that's how individual they are. And what works for this person is not necessarily going to uniformly work for another person, but what does work is the process. What does work is to start foundationally with the diet, the microbiome, the evaluations, shore up the nutrient deficiencies, look at part of methylation is detox, it's opening the detox pathways and looking at the chemical signaling, and then, then working for infectious or environmental influences. And then we evaluate the immune system, okay? Because your immune results might be skewed by a pathogen that we haven't, that we detect and eradicate, and your immune system actually might be able to come back into some stasis if it's a singular thing like that. And now we have the whole variable too of COVID infections. COVID is a really not cool, but fascinating virus in that it does suppress your T cells, and it's either and for some people, some other parts of your immune system for about 4 months. And so you get a COVID infection, and it doesn't have to be a bad one. It can be a common cold kind of COVID infection. But when we trend your T cells, your B cells, and your natural killer cells, when you get that COVID infection, they start to tank. And at about 3 weeks, we start to see them go down. And at about 4 months, they hit a nadir. And that's why we're seeing the reactivation of Lyme, the reactivation of EBV, the reactivation of a lot of different of these chronic pathogens. Now that we have this virus that comes in and sort of says, "Hey, immune system, take a break for about 4 months." And then it will, if you don't get reinfected with COVID again in that period of time, it will start to come up, and then your immune system can actually come back up to where it was and fight things off effectively. But not if you've reactivated your Lyme in the meantime. And so that's why we see a lot of people, some of this long COVID syndrome is infectiously triggered, immune systems. And some of this long COVID syndrome is chronic reactivation of Lyme or EBV or other kinds of pathogens like that. So there's lots of different factors that play into it, which is why the only hope that we feel like we have of sussing out how to come back to health is just to go step by step, one thing at a time. Let us look at this system, let us look at this problem, let us look at that problem, and let's keep a running tally, let's keep a list, let our team make sure that they're tracking all of these pieces because we tell people all the time, as a chronic illness patient, your only job should be implementation. And really, it's even hard sometimes just to get up and get a shower, right? So having to manage your appointments and manage how many supplements you've got to take here and there, and when are you supposed to do your medications? How do I even get that one? And am I authorized for it? And all of these things, we would like for patients just to focus on, okay, this is what I'm supposed to eat today. This is the rest I'm supposed to get. Here's my medications that I'm supposed to take, and not have to worry about the order of implementation and what is the priority and have I tested this before, and all that kind of burden that has fallen to patients who have these kinds of overarching diseases. There's just not a good system in place to do it for patients in our traditional medical system. And so that's sort of why we do what we do, is to try to take that burden off of the patient so that the patient can focus on implementation and healing.
Okay, so when a patient comes to you, you indicated that you're asking them to bring with them the medical records that they can bring with them for the last 2 years. Is that
They got to send them in ahead of time because we want to read them before we see them. We don't
okay?
want to sit, we don't want to take your time. We don't want to say, come to our clinic, sit here for an hour while we read through your records. No, we want you to send those records in at least 2 weeks in advance. And they're going to go over to our research team, who's going to read through every page and index them and pull out all of the relevant stuff that you've had done in the past and compare it to our algorithm and see. We don't want you to repeat stuff that you've already done. We're trying to be efficient, not redundant. And so by the time you walk in the door, having sent us those records, then we already have a synopsis now that your provider has reviewed of, okay, this is what they tested positive for. This is what hasn't been tested. These are the jewels that were buried in those records, that maybe
Okay.
need to be readdressed.
So let's take, and you indicated that there's also a lengthy questionnaire that they have to fill out, and that
Mm-hmm.
has to be sent in before they come in to see you as well, right?
Yeah, correct. Mm-hmm.
So what are you doing? So you said you have an algorithm that you use. So the records are being reviewed and the data is being put into your algorithm. The questionnaires data is being put into the algorithm, and now the patient is coming in for the first time.
Mhm.
Now, is there any communication from you to the patient? Meaning, are you giving the patient any information about what it is that they're about to undergo before they come in for the first appointment?
So we have now actually implemented again. We have new patient orientation Zooms, just like this, where I say algorithm because it is very algorithmic. It's not an actual like program we put stuff in. It's manually done, and it's manually entered into the chart and manually trended and tracked by real people. But what we do is we have what we call our pyramid. It's our diagnostic pyramid, and it sort of, tells you about that progression of that systematic signaling information that we're looking for. And so you would come in, you would get it's right now it's the third Wednesday of every month. We do a new patient orientation where we would explain that to you. We would explain to you the process and what you can expect and what we're looking for and how we're looking for it. And then when you come into your appointment, then what's going to happen is your provider is going to have questions of clarification about your specific case because even though we have 800 pages of records, you have information that's not in those records. And only you also know what you're currently doing because we may have an appointment medication list from last week and you may have tweaked something and maybe doing something completely different this week. And so the provider is going to have reviewed all of this stuff. You're going to have been oriented in your new patient orientation class, hopefully. If not, we have a binder, a new patient binder that goes to you that has the pyramid in it. It has some explanation about why diet is important and things that you can track for us. You're going to talk to your provider. The provider is going to be already ready to make some suggestions, like you said. And you call them maybe more of the lifestyle suggestions, but some of them may be also targeted to those current symptoms that you told us in that questionnaire are really important to you. And you're already going to be able to start making changes. While then we also order some of the tests that we need to move it forward. And the way that it works in our clinic is you leave that appointment with a list. And there's two sections to your list. One is a diagnostic section and one is a treatment section. And we try to make sure there's no more than 3 items in either section. Sometimes there might be one item in each section. It just sort of depends on how you're feeling, what your overwhelm is, what your bandwidth is. Financially, there's some things that cost a little bit of money to implement. And so, but you have this list of the next 3 diagnostic steps you're supposed to take and the next 3 treatment things that you're supposed to try. And when we come back, we see our patients usually every 4 to 6 weeks. And the first thing that your provider will do after that is she will pull up that list or he will pull up that list and say, okay, I see that you were supposed to start your B12. Did you do that? And you'll be like, yeah, sure, I did that. And they'll annotate, okay, that one's done. Did you, take your DHHB for sleep? No, I didn't get to that one. Okay, not done yet. And as they work through that list with you, anything that you didn't do will move over to your list for your next visit. And anything that you did do will be recorded and your response will be recorded to it. And then as the results come in, there will be more suggestions made based on those results and based on your response to whatever kinds of other things we have implemented. And then it's rinse repeat, but you always have that list to go back and say, what did she say? What was I supposed to do? Oh, look, I was supposed to, go to LabCorp and get my blood drawn before my next visit. It tells me right here that there should be a lab slip in my email. And then you work through the process that way, and we work through it with you so that it becomes hopefully less of a burden to you as the patient to try to figure out what to do next or remember what to do. And we're really, really big on you understanding why you're doing stuff too. We don't want to just tell you, hey, go do the X, Y, or Z. We want you to know why you're doing X, Y, or Z because that gives us a whole lot better chance that you're actually going to do it. Otherwise, life's complicated. It's hard. And so I may choose not to do that, especially if I don't understand why.
Yeah, and of course it is important to give people the why in part for buy-in, but in
Mhm.
part so that they can report back to you with I think a healthier context what is happening and what their onboard diagnostic system is telling them. So now,
Exactly.
as it relates to testing, Kara, um, do you outline for your patients what testing they're going to undergo and why, meaning the order of the tests and what they can expect from each of these tests and why you're doing a test in a particular order?
So in the beginning, we're not going to give you a comprehensive list because then you're going to want us to run them all at once. And then again, we're going to get an information dump. You're going to be overwhelmed. We're not going to implement effectively. So, we are going to tell you what we're going to evaluate. And then which test we pick for you, it's going to depend on a few things. It's going to depend on where you are. It's going to depend on what your health insurance is, or if you're paying out of pocket, what's your financial situation. And then it's also going to depend on your individual medical profile. So while, for example, we test everybody's stool, okay, without fail, at some point, we are going to test your stool.
And what are you
Um,
testing for, and what kind of tests are you using?
so we are testing digestive markers. So we're going to make sure that you're digesting your nutrients and absorbing them properly. We're looking for intestinal inflammation. We're looking for your pancreatic enzyme level. Do you have a calprotectin or a lactoferrin elevation showing us that your intestines are irritated? Your zonulin level, how leaky is your gut? Because that can also affect how leaky your brain is and inflammation in your immune system. We're going to run all of those digestive markers. And then we're also going to look at your microbiome. And we might look at your microbiome through a PCR. We might look at it through a culture. We might look at it at a combo test that looks at it, in a more comprehensive picture. It sort of depends on what else you have going on. At the same time, like what are your symptoms? Do you need everything covered by your insurance, or do you have $100 budget for that stool test, or do you have a $400 budget for that stool test? Sort of depending. But we are going to do some kind of systematic evaluation of your GI tract as foundational.
So
But
that's test number one, Kara. The stool test is number one.
for most people, now again, if you come into our clinic and say you have, dysautonomia and extreme pain, that's not in your GI tract, maybe it's extreme joint pain. Maybe you have extreme joint pain and dysautonomia as your primary presenting symptom, and maybe you also have like a MCAS presentation or something like that. We may not start with stool, we may start with blood. But in our typical scenario, if you are just walking along with your kind of chronic stuff, you're not like in an acute exacerbation of something, then we usually start with stool. If we think that you also have a pretty strong case for immune dysregulation affecting your neurological inflammation, we're probably going to swab your nose at the same time and look for any pathogens living in your sinuses, because that becomes a big issue as well. And then we're going to check then we're going to check your bloods for various and sundry. Like I said, sort of we will do your blood more than once, because we can't get enough blood to check for everything all at the same time, without making you pass out. And so like I said, we usually start with those nutrient deficiencies, and then we'll look at like methylation, your sulfur stores, your detox system. And then from there, we might move into and we have an initial lab set that has like some immune markers in it. I mean, we do a CBC, a CMP. We're looking at your white blood cells. We're looking at your liver. We're looking at your kidneys. We're getting baselines on a lot of things. And we actually do usually run a lymphocyte panel, looking at your TB and natural killer cells, just to sort of see where you are in that with that inflammatory thing. We look at your immunoglobulin levels, because sometimes we may stumble across a immunoglobulin deficiency right off the bat, and we're like, oh, no wonder you're sick 24/7. You don't have immunoglobulin A. Or whatever it is. So we do have those screeners that happen. But in general, first would be your stool, your microbiome, and your diet. We have a diet diary template that we might ask you to fill out. And we may have one appointment that's just around your diet, depending on how prevalent we think that is. And then after we do your stool, we'll do your blood. And then we have a few specialty tests that a lot of people in our clinic run, not all of them, but we typically do a mitochondrial function assay, and we typically do test for cerebral folate deficiency, or folate receptor antibodies, because they're fairly common in our population, sort of across the board. So those are some of the specialty tests that sort of tend to fall somewhere in our evaluations. A lot of times we run the preliminary labs. We usually always get hits on 3 or 4 things at least that we need to be checking or fixing. And then that also might give us the clue about what we need to test next as well.
Now, are you starting with the stool test, and because most of the immune system, or the overwhelming majority of the immune system, is in the gut, and you're getting sort of double bang for the buck?
That's one of the reasons we start with it, and that's a really good one. The other reason why we start with the stool test is that if you aren't absorbing nutrients, we can't correct any of your signaling, and you won't have the energy to power your immune system to get rid of pathogens. So if basically everything you eat is just going straight through you to the toilet, and you're not absorbing your fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, that's what fuels your mitochondria. That's how you make ATP. That's how you stay alive. you know. And so we have to make sure that digestion and microbiome, so it's not just about the buggies that are living there helping you or hurting you. It's also about how much of the nutrition that you're consuming is actually getting into your bloodstream and to your organs and your tissues, and utilized in your signaling processes.
So, Kara, we've had some folks on this podcast share with us that a game changer for them were fecal transplants. Um,
Hmm.
Talk to me about what your experience, if any, is with fecal
Hmm.
transplants, and would you use them early on in somebody's treatment journey?
Well, I have to first give the disclaimer that fecal transplants are only FDA approved in the United States for C. diff. And so let's just get that out there right
Thank
away.
you. Thank you.
Um,
We like all of the.
Um, but we have some really great and interesting options, obviously coming from the autism world and Dr. Adams' studies. We are very familiar with fecal transplant and the changes that it can make. And being sort of, microbiome modulators, we also are aware that there can be a role for fecal transplant. We don't believe that everybody needs a fecal transplant. The sort of unofficial rule in our clinic is that we test your microbiome and we do a round of gut modulation. And what that might look like is it might look like herbals, it might look like antibiotics, it might look like diet change, it might look like a combination of all those things. Once we've done that 3 times, 3 rounds of gut modulation, if you were making very, very minimal progress, then we might say to you, hey, there's something called that we call a fecal probiotic, and it comes from Europe. And basically, it's a consumer-driven way that you can, do your fecal transplant at home. And it is expensive, but it is something that, for some people works really well. There's also an even newer formulation now that is it's called a postbiotic. It's called Thana postbiotic, and it's actually it's sterilized. It's dead. It's not live. The fecal transplant, of course, it's the live bacteria to repopulate. Well, there's a really interesting naturopath who figured out that it doesn't really matter what kind of bacteria you have in your gut. What matters are the metabolites the signals that they're putting off. What matters is their products that they're producing to make your intestinal environment beneficial. And so she actually developed an extract from stool, and it is from donor stool, of those chemical products that the bacteria produce. So there's no live bacteria in it. There is just the signaling chemicals from the bacteria in it. And that's something that actually we're just starting to explore because I mean that just came to market around 2020 and it hasn't been around as long. And so we were actually familiar with Adams, sending some people to Adams, sending some people actually out of the country to Mexico or Europe to get the fecal transplants for various and sundry things. And then it's called microbioma, where you can get them from Europe. And we do help people, work through that process themselves in certain cases. Now, it's not necessary for everybody. A lot of people can modulate their gut without that. Sort of depends on, again, how far gone it is, and how if we can bring it back with something simpler or something less expensive. Of course, that is also going to be our preference. And there is a protocol around it, right? Like there's a whole preliminary, like the weeks before, you need to, there's certain dietary changes you need to make. There's a antibiotic gut wipe to try to make it take, and all of that kind of stuff. So fecal transplant it's not like a first line thing. We're going to just run in and say, hey, everybody go get a fecal transplant, but it is a tool. We say our patients, we are a truly integrative clinic. And what that means is we are not completely functional and we are not completely allopathic. We actually straddle the aisle and we pull every tool in the toolbox because our patients need them. Our patients are complicated, they're complex, and they deserve consideration. So we may grab a surgery, we may grab an herb, we may grab a psych med, we may grab a supplement. It just, we may ask you to modify diet. We may ask you to do a neurological reorganization exercise, like just whatever it is that fits your individual picture that we feel like would improve your health is what we want to choose. And we don't want to limit ourselves and say, oh no, we're not even going to look at that because we have to be strictly FDA approved. Or, oh no, we're not going to look at that because we can only do herbal green stuff. We want to do like it all, anything that has evidence behind it, and anything that we can monitor. You mentioned a lot of times that our patients, need to help us by telling us what's changing or how are they reacting to stuff. And a lot of times we'll pick a target symptom. We'll say, okay, well, your OCD is very debilitating. And your major OCD is maybe you have a ritual when you leave a room. And we'll say, all right now, what we want you to do is we want you to take 2 days. We want you to sort of track the frequency of how many rituals you have to do to leave a room. Then we're going to make this change for you. And we want you to be tracking every day along the change. Okay, maybe I was doing the ritual 10 times and now I'm doing it 5 and now I'm doing it 2, and what changed in between there. And when we do things like test our stool, we're trending at a species level of bacteria. So we're looking at, you had a 4+ E. coli overgrowth to begin with, then we modulated here. Well, maybe that didn't change. Then we modulated again, and now you have a 1+, or maybe we've eradicated it. We're tracking, and we have just so much data on what has worked and what hasn't worked for different conditions for each individual patient. We're really interested in publishing it once we get the bandwidth. We're so busy taking care of the patients right now. We are getting the tracking in, but our next step, and one of the reasons why we did develop the model where we have the research team to help us, is so we can start publishing some of this stuff,
Okay.
because it is fascinating.
I heard an interview with a founder of a gut biome company named Viome. And his
Mhm.
argument was that we really are at a very primitive state at this time with the both the testing and the treatment tools for microbiome challenges. Give me your perspective. Do you agree with the founder of the Viome company, or do you think we're further along than a primitive level?
Again, it depends on if you're talking about pragmatically what to do about certain things, or if you're talking about understanding every tiny mechanism.
Well, give me
We
both.
are, yeah,
I'll let you make both arguments.
yeah. So, if you do Viome, for example, you could actually get, uh, tons and tons. You could get thousands of species sequenced in your microbiome, and it's not helpful information because we don't know what to do with all that information. He's absolutely right in terms of, we a lot of these stool tests that you can utilize give you such minutiae that it would take you forever to even figure out what to do with that, and that we're not necessarily interested in that much minutiae. We are interested in, are you pooping every day? Okay. And, is it, nice formed regular stool, right? Do you have any gastrointestinal pain? And then do you have major infectious overgrowths? And then there are certain species like Proteus mirabilis. We found a connection where if you have a Proteus mirabilis overgrowth, when you see patients that are ragey and self-injuring, almost like patients when they have Bartonella, they could have a Proteus mirabilis overgrowth in their intestine. And we've
What is
had
what
some.
is what is that? Proteus mellopolis?
Yeah, it's a bacterial
Okay.
strain that lives in the intestine. But when we see Proteus mirabilis overgrowth, that's when we see these, young adults smashing their parents' car windows or tearing up the drywall, or they get it just makes them very angry and irritable. And we'll test their stool and they'll have Proteus mirabilis. We'll modulate, we'll kill it, and they'll come back and they'll just be their sweet selves like they were before. You know.
And how do you kill that microbe?
You can either use antibiotics or you can use certain herbals. We do have now, there's a fabulous lab that we've sort of been collaborating with in Delaware. It's called RSM Diagnostics, and they've done sensitivity testing for us, both for antibiotics and for our favorite natural antimicrobials, to give us a susceptibility profile. So we have a better chance of picking the right one. And some of that also comes down to patient preference. Some patients come into the clinic and they say, do not give me an antibiotic ever. I only want to use natural things. And so if we can, and we're always about informed consent. We'll tell them, oh, well, we might try this, but it has a 40% chance of working in our experience, but that they say do it, then that's what we'll pick, or we have other patients that are like, do not give me an herb. I want FDA approved prescription medications. And we'll be like, okay, well, here's your choice there. Like I said, that's part of our like every tool in the toolbox. And from in Arkansas, we used to say there's more than one way to skin a cat. you know, there's often multiple pathways to achieve the same result.
Yeah, no, no, we're with you. I mean, we argue regularly that we're agnostic as to treatment protocol. We have to
Hmm.
open up the entire toolbox and we have to find the tool that meets your need at any particular moment. And obviously your needs are going to change as time goes on and as you as you go on the journey. So we're with you. We think
Hmm.
and I'm excited to hear that you're also doing some of the testing that you're doing because in most cases, what's happening is there's use of broad spectrum antibiotics, and that's a problem. Right? I mean, when you're
Yeah,
killing
it
everything,
is.
you may be solving one problem or temporarily solving one problem, creating many other problems and using broad spectrum. And you're not testing the person who is going to be using that treatment protocol to determine whether or not it's going to be successful with them for them. Right?
Exactly. Exactly. Like I said, we're big proponents of individualized treatment. And what works for one person doesn't always work for the next person either. So the profile is going to vary, I mean, azithromycin is great for some people, but not for people who have QT or not for people who have a bunch of other medications that might interact with it. And so then minocycline might be great for those people, but not for people who have severe mitochondrial dysfunction or not for kids, that are little. So like we're going to have to look at everybody's individual profile, and we're going to have to do a little bit of personalization in medicine. And that's really what I think makes success in medicine is when you have those providers, those practitioners that can look at you. And your individual characteristics and your individual test, and let that be the roadmap, not some one size fits all. Everybody needs to do this kind of
Well, but
kind of
Carrie,
protocol.
it's got to, when you have somebody who's chronically ill, they're an outlier, right? And unfortunately, what most folks don't recognize is that almost all of the medical protocols that are being used in a traditional medical doctor's office are based on a bell-shaped
Yes.
curve, and they will work for 80% of the people, right? But
Hmm.
if you're chronically ill, you're an outlier on one side of the
Right.
curve or the other. And because you're an outlier, we do have to take the next step and we do have to make some more specific inquiries to determine how and why you're an outlier so that we can meet your needs because the traditional protocols are not going to work. And it's one of the reasons why people who are chronically ill, especially with Lyme disease, often hear from their doctors, A, either they don't want to treat them, or B, it's in their head. Well, the reason the doctors are saying it's in your head is because the algorithm, to use that term again, that they were taught in medical school is not going to work for 20% of the population. So that means as clinicians, they have to step out of the traditional protocol and find something that works for the outlier. The problem with treating the outlier for the clinician is it's risky. And the reason it's risky is if you're not using generally accepted medical practices in the treatment of a patient, and a patient has a bad outcome, that is the standard for a lawsuit, and it puts you in a position.
I'll tell you, Rich, I used to think that was the driving factor, and I'll tell you now from the other side, coming into it as a mom, and I was actually a licensed midwife for a while, so I did maternal child health. But coming into it now running these clinics, some of it's risk-based, don't get me wrong, but a lot of it is the problem with payer reimbursement, and it's expensive. If I can look in my book and follow an algorithm and treat you and get you in and out the door in 15 minutes, then I can see, four people in an hour. But if it takes me 45 minutes or even, for God forbid, 60 minutes to figure out what's going on with you, and I have to look at three or four different algorithms because you have three or four different problems, and I have to see where those intersect, then especially if I take insurance, like we do, by the way. The insurance company is going to pay me less to see one patient in 60 minutes than it's going to pay me to see four patients in 60 minutes, and I'm going to lose money. And so all of our medical system right now is based on insurance reimbursement, and it's based on sort of a cattle call where you get people in and out and in and out and in and out. And the only way to do that is to, and it's really a lot, honestly, a lot of times it's not the doctor's fault. They didn't go to med school to run a cattle call. They went to med school. The providers went to med school. By and large, most providers, they didn't even go to med school to get rich. They went to med school to help people because that's what they thought would be make their life, interesting. And instead, they find themselves stuck in these cattle calls based on bottom line profits. And so then they're faced with, okay, well, I can go to be a cash-based practice, but then I'm not accessible to a large chunk of the population. And so then only wealthy people are allowed to heal and allowed to get better, or to stay accessible to people who have Medicaid and Medicare and are disabled and are not independently wealthy. Then I have to meet certain payment metrics. And so it's really, really hard to balance that, even more than the risk. The risk stuff, you can always come through, so we all know that it takes about 20 years for something to get from bench into regular allopathic practice. So by the time we discover it, and then we test it, and then we approve it, and then we implement it, to get it into med schools, it's going to take at least 20 years, which of course patients don't have, right? But there is a process for that. There is a way that you can justify, and our CMO does a great job of balancing this, when he looks at how to write these protocols and how to use these things that are off-label treatments, he's like, all right, if I have to stand up and explain this to a judge, where is my rationale and justification? If you can find that, if you can find the research rationale, if you can show me the evidence that I'm working in evidence-based medicine, I'm going to sign off on that, because that's what I'm going to go and explain to a judge. So the risk part of it, unless you're really doing something that's not evidence-based, that can be managed. But what's really, really hard to manage is the fact that you, as a complex patient, need more than 15 minutes of time. You need probably 2 hours of time. And who's going to pay for that time? Especially if you can't pay for that time, who's going to pay for that time?
Okay, one of the questions that Matt has traditionally asked our patient.
If you let me speak, Rich, I would ask the question probably. I'm busting your
well,
chops.
You and I are enjoying each other so much, Kara, that I'm keeping Matt out altogether.
He's
I was
boxing
gonna
me
say,
out,
it's awfully
Kara.
quiet.
He's boxing me out. We
One
generally
of-
split it up where Rich will
Quiet,
talk and then
Matt.
I talk, but he's not letting me now.
One of the questions that Matt has traditionally asked our patient experts is what was different between the time
You're
that
still not letting him ask it.
I'm gonna ask it anyway because he was falling asleep on me, Karen. But I will finish the question, then Matt will be able to join us.
Okay.
But he would ask, what was the difference between the way you were treated by your primary care physician and the way you were treated by your Lyme literate medical doctor? And the answer almost uniformly was that they spent more time with me and they listened to me. And my diagnostic appointment was 2 hours long with the LLMD as opposed to 15 minutes with my traditional doctor. And of course, the sad reality is that our insurance-based medical system is an acute care system. And if you're chronically ill, the only way you're going to get better is you're going to step out of the system and you're going to be treated privately. But you have to have, as you pointed out, a lot of resources to do that. Or you're going to have to take, I guess, and I don't want to call it responsibility, but I will call it responsibility because I can't think of another description right now. But you're going to have to take responsibility for educating yourself so that you can ultimately, take the steps with your primary care physician and in guidance with your primary care physician, but you're going to have to do a lot of work on your own. I think they're the only two alternatives.
Well, they're not anymore. You can come to Lighthouse, where we built a system to try to alleviate that. That's again
Help
part of the
me with
reason.
that's the question I'm asking you. So tell us about
Yeah.
Lighthouse and how Lighthouse is helping folks in that regard.
Well, that's part of the reason why we exist. Number one is we're very dedicated to accessibility. We take Medicare, we take Medicaid in multiple states. We have a reduced rate for Medicaid patients that are out of state and would have to be cash pay. We do everything in our power to be accessible to the most number of people as we can. And one of the ways that we've done that is by having this research team in place that can actually take some of the burden off the provider in terms of the digging, in terms of the reading of the records, the compiling of the results, the figuring out what's, we have protocols put into place by our CMO that say, okay, again, we have this algorithm and these are the relevant things we're looking for. And then we have a team that's not the treating provider that comes in and pulls all that information in synopsis for the provider. So then that frees the provider up. So when the provider has that hour with you or that 30 minutes with you, that piece of it, they don't have to go digging. They don't have to go looking. They don't have to try to figure things out. They have a nice synopsis in front of them that says, okay, these results said this and this result said that, and this is where they are in our algorithm, and this is what they reported last time. And then they can come in and they can do, they can look and say, okay, well, I want to know a little bit more about this, and they can click over here and check that information. But it really condenses it for them so that they can spend that visit time then talking to you, getting the information from you that only they can do, because the research team is not talking to you and they're not going to know. Then it becomes more of a relationship between you and your provider, but it also makes it feasible for us to offer insurance-based care in a reasonable time frame. Our shortest appointment is 30 minutes. And that's for our typical follow-ups. We do have hour-long follow-ups. Our initial appointments are typically an hour, so we're a little bit longer than the GPs are in what we're doing. But we also have these processes in place to try to streamline things so that you get what you need in the amount of time that we can allocate, and actually be reimbursed for. And the other thing that we do are, like I said, these educational sessions or outside classes or patient ed stuff. We do a lot of more what I think of as patient navigation, to make sure that it's not, the provider will go over something in a visit, but then if you have more questions about it, you might pop into our, IVIG session and learn about IVIG and what, more that it means. Or you might send a message in your portal and then, one of our MAs might call you back and give you handouts on certain things or explain things where you need more kind of hand-holding attention to implement something. And then that allows our providers to do what they do, which is see you in appropriate amounts of time so that, they can take care of more people.
So, Kara, quick question here. So, I've been listening and waiting to jump in, Rich. So, thanks for letting me finally hop in here. But, my background is I'm an IT professional, and I taught a lot of college classes. And one of the courses I taught was data structures. And we had to teach different reasons. I should rephrase. We had to teach why we should use different data structures in different scenarios, right? So depending on the use case and depending on the problem we were trying to solve, we would use different data structures for performance reasons and efficiency reasons to make that job run quicker from an algorithm standpoint. And you keep saying the word algorithm, which is really, this is why I'm prompting this question, right? So, we had initially it was just learn the data structure, right? And then, okay, now once you've learned a set of data structures in these use cases, which one would be best in this use case? And I feel like that's what you're describing. What I want to hear from you is, how have you been able to learn and grow and understand all these complexities and then make the patient experience to recover from Lyme shorter? Because all of us, my experience was almost 10 years suffering greatly from chronic Lyme. Some of us have suffered for decades, right? And all of us want shortcuts. And the short answer is it's never going to be overnight. But I do believe my journey could have been far shorter than it was, right? So how are you uniquely qualified with all of your experience and background, your science, your medicine, your research, right, to back all this up, to be able to help people shortcut their experiences using the algorithm you keep describing?
That's a great question. I love that question. And we tell people, give us 2 years. You may have been like this it's not going to be overnight. We can't do it in 6 months, but give us 2 years to get you to a baseline level of health. And for some people, obviously you're going to see improvement before then. But we really want to have at least 2 years to sort of work through things with you, which is shorter than 10, which is what a lot of people come into our clinic having tried. The way that we shorten that, so let's just assume that 10 sort of average, and we bring it down to 2. Number one is that tracking that I spoke about. We're testing, treating, retesting in a very systematic fashion. We're not losing those results. We're making sure we follow through on things, and that's part of what makes things so long. Is that if you find a problem but then you don't do anything about it for 6 or 7 years, and then it just compounds and it can make other problems, when if you had treated it all the way back in the beginning, then you may not have had to deal with the 4 or 5 things that came as sequelae, you know? And so part of the reason why we make it shorter is by doing that tracking. Part of the reason why we make it shorter is by making it very simple and systematic for the patient so that you can implement. Because again, we've seen it a lot of times where people go into a provider, they do $3,000 or $4,000 worth of specialty testing, they get all the results dumped at once, and then they'll get these, you know, visit notes where that either A, don't really tell them what to do very well, and they've given a, you know, a neuro Lyme patient 20 steps verbally without ever writing anything down, right? Or B, they have 35 steps in one thing, and some of them are even like, you know, 35 steps in one thing and I'll see you in 6 months, you know? And patients need more help than that. They need more structure than that. They need more follow-up than that to be able to effectively implement. And so part of it is having an organizational you know, backbone and structure that lets you evaluate, treat, retest, and keep track of things. Part of it is breaking it down for the patient into manageable implementation chunks and some of that back-end support for the patient to make sure that the patient can, and then actually following up to make sure it happens, you know. Hey, we ask you, you know, to get that MRI, and we noticed that you haven't done that yet. Why haven't you? Do you not know where to go? You know, is it a cost thing? Is there something that we can help you do in lieu of? Do you need some sort of support around it? You know, do you need us to help you call and make the appointment? Give us some available times. Let us call for you, and then we'll tell you when to show up. You know, we have the whole gamut of people in our clinic. Some people are very, very much, oh, I've done my research, and they jump in and they're checking off their list. And honestly, they're going a little faster because they're doing that. We have other people that are doing one thing and just one thing. And that's okay too. As long as you do the one thing and you do it effectively, then you can move on to the next step. Where people spin their wheels is when they don't know what to do, or they have 50 things that they have to pick from and they can't remember, or they're not prioritized for them. And that lengthens the whole journey. And then the last thing I will say is we're also very data-based. And if it's not working, we're just not going to keep doing it. We're not going to be that whole Albert Einstein definition of keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Yes, exactly. We're going to, you know, if you've been on, you know, hardcore antibiotics for your tick-borne illness for the past 3 years, and we need to do something different, right? If you're still feeling horrible and you can't get out of, you know, this cycle, then it's time to change it up. It's time to figure out why, you know, are those antibiotics not effective? Have you stressed your liver and kidneys out? And so now we need some support over there. Is there, you know, is there something different that works better with your biochemistry? What's the matter? Where's the breakdown in the problem? Because we don't want it to be overnight, but we always want you to be seeing continual gradual improvement, you know. And if there's not improvement, we want to understand clearly why there's not improvement. And so that's, you know, that's our goal, is to keep it organized and moving forward.
Right. So, you know, what I'm hearing is if somebody comes to you early on, which is probably rare, it's easier because the problem hasn't snowballed and compounded. But when somebody is really at the chronic stage, it's multifaceted and it's much harder. But at that point, you're going to do things sequentially, step by step, and you're not going to do an overwhelming amount of tests and overwhelming the patient where they're going to then get stuck because they're just in the state of, oh my God, this is a lot, right? But I guess the question I have for you is, in addition to, you talked about doing some, you know, microbiome testing, some immune testing, some obviously microbe testing, and then addressing things in a sequence depending on the patient. But a lot of things I think concurrently can help. So I want to kind of ask you about your approach of one thing at a time, because I can tell you, you know, in addition to addressing immune support and maybe gut health, a lot of the downstream effects of those things cause you to become even more chronically ill and more chronically immune dysfunction, you know, to cause more chronic immune dysfunction. So for example, if you can't sleep, if you have severe anxiety, right, then that's going to be problematic. So you mentioned like DHHB. So we learned a lot about that from Dr. Turnpaugh, and actually Rich and I have both taken that in his mellow supplement, and it's really helpful to sleep, right? So I guess when you say the singular approach of one thing at a time, is that one thing at a time at the root level, but then you're also going to use things like DHHB to help them sleep better, and then almost like fast track the healing of what you're focusing on in the moment? Is that your approach? I just want to better understand it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so we have what we call showstoppers in our clinic. And the showstoppers are sleep, constipation or diarrhea, pain, you know, and then injury to yourself or others. All right. Those are our 4 showstoppers. If you are not sleeping, or you're not pooping normally, or you are, you know, injuring yourself or others, or you're in pain, those supersede anything else that I can do for you, because those are going to consume every waking moment and stop your healing. And so when I say it is sort of like we have these concurrent tracks, but we never want to give you more than 3 or 4 things to do in 6 to 8 weeks, because you won't do them. Most people just will not. You'll come back to us and you'll have more than half your list that's not complete. And then you're like, well, why am I coming back here for you to tell me the same thing? And maybe you didn't even really understand why I told you to do it in the first place, because you're overwhelmed and there's too many things. And so we're not ignoring acute issues, and we are very well versed in how the dominoes fall. We know if you're not sleeping, you can't heal. We know if you're in chronic pain, then your life is unmanageable, and you're not going to be able to consistently take your medicine if you hurt all day long.
Quick pause there, Kara. So a lot of people listening would get mad and they're going to reach out and yell at me if I don't ask this question, because most people in our community are dealing with insomnia, great, horrible insomnia, and many of us with great chronic pain, myself being one of those people for quite a while. What are things you recommend, if you could just share some advice for people that they can do on their own, some easy things they can buy that are maybe natural and don't require a prescription to address sleep, pain, and also being able to poop more regularly and have a better mechanism to rid themselves of these toxins in their body?
Okay, I'll bite a little bit. um, so, I mean, you mentioned DHHB. That's one of my favorite things for sleep. I find it really, really helpful. And so we sort of have a kind of a hierarchy, and the natural things you don't have to have, prescriptions for. And so, I mean, everybody knows, or pretty much everybody knows about melatonin. But what they don't really understand usually is that melatonin, again, is super individual, and you have to do a titration to determine optimal dose for the person. And I used to give the example all the time of how my, 19-year-old needed 0.5 milligram of melatonin, and my 8-year-old needed 5 milligrams of melatonin. And you just don't know if you don't walk through that titration process. So what we do with the melatonin is we start at 0.5 milligram, and we increase by 0.5 milligram every 3rd day, until you hit a very, very vivid dream. And you will know, because it will be like you're in the dream in life, and it may or may not be pleasant. But once you hit that vivid dream, you back down 0.5 milligram, and that's your target dose. So if you have your vivid dream at 2 milligrams, you back down to 1.5 milligrams, and that's what will help you sleep and not feel groggy in the morning. So that's one thing that you can do for sleep. One of our favorite things right now for pain is actually something called PEA. And the reason why we like PEA is because not only is it an anti-inflammatory and an antihistamine, and you know that histamine levels potentiate pain. So if your histamine is not well controlled, you will feel pain more acutely. It also is a lipid molecule that blocks pain signaling in the nervous system. And so if you take PEA, you can lessen both the way that your nerves feel the pain, and you can actually have anti-inflammatory, antihistamine response. And the thing that matters, though, is the type of PEA matters. Like Miraca, I'm sorry if you're listening, but you suck. You don't work. Do not take Miraca PEA. It will not make you, not have pain. You can use nootropics at Nootropics Depot. The Nootropics Depot PEA works great, and it's relatively inexpensive. Now, the bomb PEA is the Galea that you import from Italy. And it's from Loretta Pharmacy. And if you bring that in, I mean, my kids love Galea, because my kids, especially my son, has a lot of chronic joint issue kind of pain. It also works for GI pain. And so it's probably one of my favorite things for pain at the moment, because it really, really does help a lot of people, and it doesn't require a prescription.
Can you tell us, Kara, what is PEA? Because I'm looking it up now. I'm seeing it on Amazon. It's Nootropics Depot Palmitoyl ethylenol capsules. I don't even know. 400 milligram pills. Like, what is it? Because a lot of us, I'll speak for myself and use myself as an example, right? Like, I take some adaptogens. So I take some ashwagandha, I take some L-theanine, right, from various herbal companies. And I always wonder, like, what can I mix and what can I not mix, right? So, like, I know, okay, I can do a lot of these herbal things, like, the things I just mentioned. But is this something that has to be taken in its own, or can it be kind of mixed and added in as needed for pain?
It can be mixed and added in. There's not really contraindications or things you can't, take with it. It's again, it's a lipid signaling molecule is what it is. I'll tell you, one of my favorite tools for looking at stuff like that, because, we all have PubMed for like medication interactions, but when we start to try to look at these other kinds of more natural molecules and the nootropics and the adaptogens and all of that, we sort of have to go digging. But are you familiar with the Self Hacked website?
No. Not at all.
Yeah, there's a great website, and it's a guy who's, I think his name is Joe, but it's called Self Hacked, and it goes into, he has, I think he's a PharmD, but he also has a lot of other writers, and he goes through, he actually does some genetic testing and stuff as well. But if you go through his supplement post, they are all footnoted and researched, but he gives you dosing as well. He'll do, like you just mentioned, ashwagandha, or he'll do PEA, or he'll do some of the other nootropics, the different kinds of choline, and they'll write up these articles that are also footnoted, and any studies or dosages are there. And I find it really, really helpful when I'm asking questions like you're asking.
Wow. I just literally looked it up as we are speaking and I found its website. I did PEA and there is gold on here. Oh my goodness. Thank you. So we're going to drop that in the show notes at selfhacked.com. I mean, wow. What an amazing website. I mean, all backed. Oh, this is insane.
Yes.
Oh man. Yeah. Joe Cohen, CEO. Yep. I'm looking at him now.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's
Yep.
him. And if you look at this website, just about anything, like, when we were exploring nootropics, different kind of nootropics for cognitive enhancement and stuff for patients, you can come in, and this is just a treasure trove. Because you can go straight back to the sources, you can find the studies, you can look at, what is out there and what's not out there. And it's really, really helpful. And you don't need a prescription for a lot of the things that they discuss. And it's a great research tool that anybody can use.
Wow. Okay. That's wonderful. So when it comes to poop, I have to ask, because especially, Rich loves talking about poop, but he already exceeded his quota for this interview. So I have to say, when it comes to poop, I love chlorella because for me, it's just wonderful. I'll take like 20 to 40 a day. Sometimes I'll do it for a few weeks and I'm going, I'm exercising and it's just coming out and I love it. Right. Rich takes one chlorella and I take 40 and Rich takes the one and he's in the bathroom. He's canceling all his appointments for the entire day. So, I guess, what are your thoughts on that? And also, what's your recommendation to, really help your body be able to poop more regularly and be able to detox and get all these toxins out of our body, especially if we're so toxic and inflamed to begin with, right?
Right. So again, constipation is one of our showstoppers, because if you're not pooping, like you just mentioned, you're not detoxing. Again, I like to drop these little what most people don't know. Um, And I was actually talking to another set of providers today about this. There's not one right bowel protocol. The right bowel protocol, again, is very individualized and it's what works for you. But what I think people don't know is a lot of people who have the problem with peristalsis, the wavy motion of your intestines that pushes the poop through and out. A lot of people have problems with that as a root of their constipation. And that is basically a choline deficiency. And so, if you want to actually, instead of all of these things that we take to make our stool softer or to irritate our intestines to get it to push it through and all of that, they're not really addressing that motility issue. If you want to address that motility issue, you need to get choline on board. And then what people who even know about choline won't necessarily tell you, though, is choline requires folate in its processing. If you're folate deficient, you can't utilize the choline. Your acetylcholine receptors are not giving you your peristalsis, and you're not pooping. So you have to concurrently supplement with folate. And then what a lot of people also might do is they may start taking a bunch of folate and not realize they're depleting their B12. So it's a process. It's B12, folate, choline. And that honestly will help you with so much in life, but it will really help you with your pooping. It will help you with your pooping. It will help you with your attention, your focus, your brain fog. It will help you with lots of other processes in your body, your detox processes, even your, methylation of your genes, turning things on and off, all of that. Mitochondrial function, the folate is the basis of mitochondrial function. So B12, folate, choline is a key, it's a key core sequence that a lot of people need. And we've been able to take people who've had, Botox for constipation. They've had, we had one patient that was on TPN because her bowels were so bad. We've had patients that have had really severe gastro stuff. And through a combination of microbiome work and making sure that we're not choline deficient, we've been able to correct their bowels and get them at first on a reasonable bowel protocol, and then later on mostly off of the bowel protocol and having the natural peristalsis.
So you mentioned that you take insurance, which I think is great because most people we interview that are doctors and treatment facilities don't, right? So do
Right.
you see people remotely? Because we have people listening all around the world, never mind America. So do you treat people across America, we'll start with? And if so, can they work with you virtually and potentially get covered by insurance?
Yes.
Okay. And when you,
We
oh, go ahead.
Let me caveat that for you.
Yeah.
Okay. We treat people across the US and we treat people internationally as well. I can't remember the last count of how many countries we had patients in. We do treat people virtually. If you are in the United States, we are licensed in 10 states. Okay. So you do have to figure out how to be in one of the licensed states at the time of your visit currently. Now, the way that we determine whether or not you're in one of those licensed states is at your first appointment, we ask you to send us a screenshot of a GPS showing us that you're in whatever state that you say that you're in. We upload that to your chart. And subsequent visits, we just verbally verify, hey, I see your GPS is from Colorado. I'm verbally verifying that you're in the state of Colorado. You say, yes, I'm in the state of Colorado, and we proceed with your appointment. So that is the process to be seen virtually in the US. Internationally, we don't have, the laws are governed in the US by where the patient is located at the time of the visit, not the provider. So if the patient's located internationally, then the US laws do not apply to them. The laws of the country wherever they are apply to them. So we're able to see patients in other countries across the world. Now we do, and I think right now we currently have patients that actually live in about 27 states. But they are able to send us that GPS screenshot and verbally verify that they're in a state where we have a provider licensed at the time of their visit.
Okay, so my final question before I hand it back over to Rich is going to be, we are getting ready for our Lyme disease hackathon that we do every year. And we're about to launch I believe it's our sixth, Rich, if I had to say. Yep, it's actually going to be our sixth annual Lyme disease hackathon. And what that is every May, we have people, about 20 to 30 people come up with, and it's usually more, honestly. We try to do one per day, but they come up with these short one video hacks of their best Lyme disease hack for people in the chronic Lyme community. So if I had to ask you, Kara, with all of your experience and all of your knowledge you've had and all of your life experiences, what would be your top Lyme disease hack if you had to share it with the entire community, something that can help them and give them hope in their healing journey?
Oh, that's a fabulous question. I don't know if I can pick just one. Like so many things just flash through my head, I mean, are we talking about something like start with teasel? Or are we talking about something like, test your immune system or open your detox pathways before you kill stuff? Or are we talking about please find a provider that will look at you as an individual person?
Well, I'll say
actually,
it could be any of those things, but generally what it is a very specific tool. Like, hey, for me, I love chlorella. It helps me bind toxins and I feel great. And if I feel a little sluggish, I do a cleanse, right? Or it could be, hey, you're having trouble sleeping. It's going to be a DHHB recommendation. Or, hey, you have chronic pain. It's a PEA recommendation, right? So it's a very specific thing for a very specific topic in the chronic Lyme community. So hopefully that helps.
Okay. I still don't know that I can limit myself to one. I have so many tools.
But you have to. We need one. We need one. And even though you have all of these things floating through your head, we cannot help you. You have to do this on your own. This is not an open book test. And B, we want you to pick one right off the top of your head. You don't have to be. You don't have
All
to.
right. I guess the number one easy thing that anybody with chronic illness should do that applies universally to everybody is stay hydrated. Make sure that you are actually measuring your hydration. Have a water bottle, one of those that says, hey, I started here in the morning and then here I am at the end of the day. And nobody's going to go wrong by increasing their hydration. It's going to help with your detox. It's going to help with your GI movement. It's going to help with if you have dysautonomia or any of those kind of things. You can't do anything if you're dehydrated.
Rich, can I ask one more question? I'm sorry. No, I said that was going to be my last, but it's not. So a lot of people tell us that when they drink too much water, they don't feel as well, and it doesn't actually hydrate them, especially people that have really bad POTS. They say they have to drink a lot of salt water or electrolyte water. So is there such a thing as if somebody's hearing that hack and they're going to go and they start drinking, I'll say tap water because I don't want to drink, or filtered water, I should say. Could that be bad for people that have really bad POTS related symptoms? What are your thoughts on that?
No, hydration is great for people with POTS. I mean, just straight hydration is really good for people with POTS. But you know, if you want to make it electrolyte water, you can overdo electrolytes though. You can throw your electrolytes off. And so it's really, really hard for someone to actually drink too much water.
Hmm.
Now you might be annoyed because you have to go, you know, pee frequently, or you might feel, you know, sloshy or something like that, but you're not actually ever going to hurt yourself by drinking, you know, 1.5 liters of water every day. Now, and the other thing I have to explain to people is what water actually means. Okay. Water does not mean milk. Water does not mean soft drinks. Water can be, you can put lemon juice in your water. That's okay. And you can put herbal tea in your water that's not sweetened. So, like chamomile or mint or something like that, that can count as water. But anything else, coffee does not count as water. Black tea does not count as water. You know, nothing else counts as water except for water. Just so we are clear here.
Well, and since I wasn't allowed to participate in the poop conversation, and everyone knows that's my favorite topic, and my favorite emoji is the poop emoji as well. Drinking water and staying hydrated will, of course, help you with
Yeah,
pooping as well, right?
exactly. Exactly. It will help you not be constipated. So I guess that's the number one thing that I would say to people
All right.
is stay hydrated.
I'm glad to have contributed to that conversation, uh, and contributing poop to it. So, how we wind down our podcast, Karen, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you. You've been an absolute blessing. Is we understand, and our listeners understand that the hero's journey is a journey of achievement and a journey of transformation. So, talk to us about how all of the things that you've been doing during the course of this beautiful career you developed have been transformational for you, and how have you learned more about yourself and what God has created you to do through all of this work that you've been doing?
You know, that is a fabulous question that I've never been asked in an interview. So kudos for you also for being unique and original. Um, I'll tell you that a lot of the time, I mean, and I think from, you know, from the time I was really young, a lot of existential angst and like, why are we here? What gives our life meaning? You know, what makes life worth living? All of those questions that go through our head. And for me, passion and purpose and helping other people has really been something that, you know, it makes me get up in the morning. It makes me feel like that, you know, that I make a difference in the world, even if it's just one person at a time. I saw this, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but there's a Japanese diagram and it's ikagi, and it's like find something you love that you're good at that also can make you a living. And that intersection is ikagi. Or ikagai. I'm sure I don't speak Japanese, so I'm not saying it properly. But when my first child who gets sick, my son got sick, it blew my world apart, you know. They told me he was 3.5. They told me he would never be mainstreamed in school. He would have to have a pair if he could go. They told me I would have to institutionalize him by the time that he was a teenager, that I wouldn't be able to keep my boy home, that he would have to, you know, be in a psychiatric institution. They wanted me to give him sedatives at 3.5. They told me that there was no hope. And I just couldn't wrap my head around how this beautifully and wonderfully made child who was functioning typically 3 weeks ago now was just a lost cause. And after, you know, having the motherly breakdown that I think, you know, any parent would, um, figuring his journey out and then taking what I've learned and trying to translate that into helping other people to sort of save them from that helplessness, really gives me purpose. And that's why the Lighthouse Complex Care Clinics have come together, is because you've probably seen that meme that the ones who who've come through the fire come back carrying buckets of water to lead the other people out. You know, the group of people at our clinic, we know the impotence that it is to try to have, you know, your loved one or yourself be in the position where, you know, the traditional medical system fails us a lot of the time. And not that they're not great providers that are not doing everything they can to help patients, but you feel real helpless. And you know, it's easy, I think, to go to a real dark place and sort of lose their way. And so for me, what kept me from going from that dark place is after I figured it out, sharing it with others. And every step of the way, you know, documenting it and bringing other people along. I don't ever want anybody else, and it does still happen. I can't obviously can't fix everything, but I don't ever want any other mother to sit there with her 3.5-year-old and have somebody tell her, you know what, he's institutionalized by the time he's a teenager. And I'll tell you now, you know, my son was ended up being gifted and talented in school. He played competitive soccer. He, is happy, healthy, functioning 18-year-old today, who is really proud that we have clinics, you know, because of what happened to him, that are helping other people. And so and like I said, I didn't do it by myself. Obviously, I had other people beside me with similar journeys that were doing that. So for me, it's about, people say, oh, it's altruism, or oh, you're helping, it's service, you're helping so many others. And I'm like, really, honestly, it's completely selfish, and I'll own that. You know, it really makes me feel good and makes me feel like I have a reason to be here to bring other people along with the things that I've learned on my journey.
So I'm going to challenge you on that. I was going to let you go, but I'm going to challenge you on that because this is a beautiful example of purpose, right? I mean, one of the challenges that our community often has to deal with is finding their purpose. In many cases, because folks are so sick and they've lost so much energy, they feel like they've lost their rudder or their purpose. And what we find is that the people who find their purpose find their path to healing fastest. And I've actually studied purpose pretty carefully, and I came across the work of Professor Anthony Burroughs from Cornell University. And what he argues is that there are three different paths to purpose. One path to purpose is a life-changing monumental event will reveal God's purpose for you, or why God created you. The second way that you'll find purpose is by watching someone else pursue their purpose. For example, listening to this podcast and watching you in the pursuit of your purpose can give me clues into my purpose. And the third way that you can find purpose is to reflect on the things that you've always done during the course of your life, your hobbies, or the things that you've always sort of turned back to during the course of your life, and mainly beginning during childhood, that will then also give you a clue to your purpose. And one of the reasons why we go through, for example, the background questions that we go through is because in many cases it shows that full circle and people come back to the place where they were. So this is not selfish. You cannot be selfish, and you are clearly not a selfish human being. So I am going to challenge you on that, Kara. You are an unbelievably beautiful, giving person who found her purpose. And through finding and pursuing your purpose, unfortunately, it had to be, the challenge that a young mom had with a 3-year-old child. But it is through that purpose that you found, it's through that event that you found your purpose. And now you're doing what every one of us is created to do, and that is serve other people. So you are not at all selfish. I'm going to pull that away from you, despite you making that argument. And thank you for all the great work you're doing. And thank you for spending some time with us, because this was a really powerful interview. And I do not apologize to Matt for dominating the conversation.
You should, because I have so many more questions I would have asked, Rich, but we're almost 2 hours in. So we're going to have to get you back, Kara, because I have so many more questions that just frankly aren't answered at this point. So I don't know.
Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm happy to come back anytime. This has been a whole lot of fun. You guys are awesome to talk to. So thanks for having me here, and just let me know and I'll be back.
Thank you.